Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name's Emma Reynolds. I'm the Managing Director for Public Affairs Policy and Research at the City UK. It's my great pleasure to say a warm welcome to everybody who's attending this event in person. It's so nice to see people here. And there are also people online, and welcome them as well. We're here to launch the City UK and PwC's report on enabling the net zero transition and the role of financial and related professional services. And I would like to thank in particular Isabelle Jenkins, who leads PwC's UK's financial services practice, a valued member of our Leadership Council. We met only this morning, so you're having a City UK day today, Isabelle, and some others. Thank you for hosting the event this afternoon, and also to thank John Williams at PwC and his team for partnering with us on this report. And I'll introduce John properly in a minute. John's going to be presenting the report to us. You'll find a high-level summary. The report is much meatier than this, but obviously this is the environmental way of doing it. And so for those of you who are QR code friendly, if you're not, ask somebody probably slightly younger and they'll tell you how to use it. Please download the full report. There's a lot of good material in there. We've done lots of interviews with our members, and there's a call to action for the government. You'll see there's a 10-point plan in there as to what we want the government to do, and we'll be asking Hugh Williams about that on the panel. No pressure, Hugh. We saw last year in Glasgow at COP26 that there was a real focus on the role of private finance in the transition to net zero, and I think it was the first time at one of these COPs that you'd actually seen such a that a light was shone on the critical role of our industry. The climate change emergency requires speedy and decisive action, and we haven't got that long, actually, until we need to meet those targets. In the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, and actually at COP26 and since then, the government has been very active in setting out new policies and ambitions and consulting our industry, and we thank them for that. We thank them for that partnership. And our industry has significantly increased its support and focus on net zero in recent years. We do a member survey, and about 6-7 years ago, sustainability was kind of a bottom of a long list, and now it features in the top 2 or 3 things, sometimes right at the top. We ask our firms what the key issues and challenges and opportunities that they're facing. But the main message today is that although we are making good progress, we need to accelerate the partnership between government and industry to reach our net zero targets, and that this will require significant policy leadership and a good policy framework from the government, and it will also require our industry to step up, and it will require substantial investment. So the report highlights the enabling role of financial and related professional services critically in the transition to net zero, and we were absolutely delighted to partner with PwC and John Williams and his team on the report. I hope you'll take the time to read it, and please do give us feedback too. And without further ado, John is going to present the report before we go over to our panel. John Williams is PwC UK Partner, Global Banking and Capital Markets ESG Leader, and UK Chair, Sustainability and Climate Change. Over to you.
Emma, thank you very much. We were absolutely delighted to partner with City UK, your team, and while you've credited me with the report, it's nothing to do with me whatsoever. Actually, it's a team sat at the front, so Simon, David, Sophie, who worked really hard with you guys to get it done. So credit where credit is due. I think we also really benefited from your membership. So we were able to go and talk to the brilliant banks, insurers, asset managers, legal firms, dare I say it, accountants, and to get a really rich set of views. And I always say, London is the preeminent green finance centre. I know other cities claim that, but we should claim it for ourselves. So we really benefited from that deep knowledge. But why did we write the report? Back in 2009, we did a report with the World Economic Forum called Critical Mass: How to Scale Up Investment in Low Carbon Infrastructure in Developing Countries. I remember one asset manager saying there's only 3 problems. We don't do low carbon, we don't do infrastructure, and we don't do developing countries. And that was kind of the prevailing view as to why doing anything to tackle climate change back in 2009 was very difficult. But I think we don't do this at our peril. If you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, 2007, top risk, global pandemic. 2008, it's fallen off a cliff because we're dealing with a short-term financial crisis. And we forgot about it for a decade, and it then came and hit us right between the eyes. We have a decade to fix climate change, 2 business cycles, and that's really why we need to write the report. And the role of finance is crucial, because if we're going to do this, it's going to cost a lot of money. But don't think of costs, think of investment, and think of return on investment. And the 125 trillion that is needed to deal with the crisis that we've got today, 87 trillion, about 70%, comes from the private sector. What a brilliant opportunity for us to remove our balance sheets from where they are today, or our investment portfolios, and all the advice that goes around it, whether it be risk advice from insurers, from brokers, from accountants, from lawyers, etc. What we've tried to do in the report is to really think about what are the barriers that stop this happening? How do we harness the skills that we've got and we've collected in the sector? And then what really do we see we can do with government, and what do we need from government to help us make this happen? The approach we went through was to talk to people, as I said. We spoke to your members, we spoke to people like the British Business Bank, for example, the ICAEW. So we tried to canvass the sort of wisdom of the crowd, as I say, and to really think about what the solutions are. When I started doing, well, that's when I started doing banking, because that really will age me. But when I started doing sustainable finance in 2001, we wouldn't have been able to think like this. We wouldn't have had the pools of expertise. We were sort of really pushing water uphill, frankly. And actually, if I think about what the financial services and professional service industry has achieved in those 21 years, it's been quite incredible. We actually now can't have a conversation without saying ESG, which is great. But we've got so much more we need to do, and so much more we can do if we're going to tackle the problem. 3 things that we felt were the really main barriers that we heard from the research that was done. Firstly, sort of pervasive policy, business, and technological risk issues. So actually really making sure that we have clear policies that enable real economy decarbonisation, that the finance sector and the professional services sector can get behind and finance with certainty. Making sure that technological risks are understood, and that people that understand them can remove that risk from the person that doesn't. So CCS, for example, is a really good example where early action by government, by other people who understand those risks and are prepared to take them, can actually improve the risk profile for a debt provider or an equity provider for a CCS project, for example. I think the second thing, and it won't surprise you me to say this, a lack of good quality data. I was working with one of my banking clients. They had 4% of their balance sheet. They could get carbon emissions from the clients that they're lending to. 4%. You don't make a decision with 90%, 96% of the information unknown. You're just not going to get a board to get behind that. So really thinking about different ways of unlocking data. I sit on the advisory board of Bankers for Net Zero, and we're looking at how the SMEs and the data that they have in the supply chain of our bigger real economy companies, can really flow, not through corporate reporting. And as a member of the TCFD, I probably shouldn't say that, but actually through the invoices that are issued every day into the supply chain, because we really believe the financial number in the invoice, we need to believe the carbon number, for example. And I think the third thing is real clarity on real economy decarbonisation. It's not really the carbon emissions of the banks and insurers, etc. The emissions of our building here, as a very efficient building, are an irrelevance to the real economy emissions. So you're really understanding what that transition pathway looks like by sector, by industry, by company, that build up to that economy decarbonisation is really clear. And there's a really strong reason why we need to do it now. Yesterday, we launched our Net Zero Economy Index. Usually, it's a moment of great elation, when you get a report out as we're finding today. The reading is depressing. It is really depressing. The G20 decarbonised at 0.5%, 0.5% last year. The required rate to hit net zero has gone up from 12.9% to 15.2% per annum. No country anywhere in the world ever has achieved that level of decarbonisation. So it is a real imperative. And reading as I do that climate change is on the back burner at the UN General Assembly this week makes slightly more depressing reading. So the more that we can do in the UK to maintain leadership with government, with the finance sector, with professional services, and with real economy progressive companies is absolutely key. I could go through all 10 of the recommendations. I won't do that because you can read them themselves. But there were 4 that stood out to the team that I just wanted to illustrate. I think firstly is having those detailed, long-term, stable policies that drive real economy decarbonisation. Let's not forget that in the UK, we have legally binding carbon targets and a 5-year carbon budget. There aren't many countries in the world that will do that today, let alone when we did this all those years ago. So we've got a really good track record, but turning it into detailed sector level plans as part of an industrial strategy is key. So we know what we have to do, and we've got the legally binding framework. It's now writing the implementation manual. So setting that sort of net zero 2050, 2040, 2030 interim target plan for the economy, and then saying, put the money behind it, because you know that that's what we will do. The other area we looked at was carbon pricing. I'm not going to get into a tax versus markets debate because we could write another report on that, but actually having a price of carbon that is substantially higher than the price we have today, it's probably north of £100 a tonne, will really drive capital to flow from high carbon to low carbon, because companies will want to get rid of high carbon assets and replace them with low carbon assets. So again, a carbon price is absolutely critical. Final area, I think, is really about sharing risk. People talk about blended finance, and for me, it sounds sort of a rather bland term for things that at a detailed level sit there. But there is a good example in the UK of blended finance, and that's the Climate Finance Accelerator. So on the sidelines of COP15, a wonderful lady, Tessa Tennant, who sadly is no longer with us, and a couple of others of us sat down and said, what would be a really practical way of getting finance into the Paris Agreement? And the idea that we took to BEIS, and that BEIS have now supported at a substantial level, was to say, let's pick now 8 countries, let's work with the governments, with the private sector, and come up with real economy projects that need to be financed. And then let's bring bankers, insurers, asset managers from London to work on those projects and turn them into term sheets. And in phase 1, we raised 5.5 billion for projects that wouldn't have happened. And that was the pilot phase. Phase 2 is now substantially bigger. It's running for 3 years. And that's a really good example of country governments, both in this case, the SEDO and BEIS, working with professional services and financial services to put real money into real projects to achieve real decarbonisation. And I think that's a really good example. We just need loads more of them. There are other recommendations there for government, and I'm sure the panel will discuss it. But, I think I'll go back to Steve Howard when he set up the climate group. He said, we're in this together. We cannot do it alone. We need government. We need the people in this room and the industries you represent. We need real economy companies to work together, enabling policy environment that the finance sector can put money into, professional services can put advice and risk management into. There is no plan B. We have 2 business cycles, 10 years to get this right. Otherwise, forget about net zero. We'll be talking about adaptation and which countries are even more vulnerable than what we're seeing in Pakistan at the moment. So look, I don't want to end on a negative tone. The opportunities are huge, and a financial centre will lead in this space, and it should be London. And I think the City UK will be at the heart of that. So I'll hand over. I'm handing back to you or to the panel.
We're going to take our seats. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for reminding us that we have a climate emergency on our hands, but there are opportunities that come with that. And we've got a stellar cast list here, panel, who I'm going to introduce. Thank you so much for being with us. So Isabelle, who I've already introduced before, but who leads Leader of Industry for Financial Services at PwC. Agnès Gourc, Head of Sustainable Capital Markets at BNP Paribas. Richard Dudley, to my left, Global Head of Climate Strategy at Aon, and Hugh Williams, Head of Investor Relations at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS. Thank you all so much for being with us. Isabelle, in your role leading the financial services practice here at PwC, you work with a broad range of organisations. What are you seeing are the challenges in the market and the marketplace? What do you think are the really big issues that we're looking at?
Thank you. And I'd like to say welcome to everyone. We're so pleased to see you here today at PwC, and thank you for all the work Ashley and the team have done with us. It's a really exciting time to be working with financial services clients and net zero. And I come back to a thing that you said about the level of activity that you're seeing through your surveys, and I would echo that is what we're seeing in the industry. I think what's interesting though is the goalposts keep moving. And what was sort of good a few years ago when people were sort of setting their net zero plans is not leadership today. And what leadership will need to be in the next sort of 18 months, 2 years, will need to be much further in excess of what we're seeing. So it's not enough to just be doing the TCFD reporting and having set your plans. You need to now actually be broadening reporting, and you need to be implementing those areas. So what specifically are we seeing financial services organisations do? I think there are really 3 key areas. The first is around capital allocation, and that's both about identifying and developing low carbon investment products, but also then about supporting sustainable finance to support transition planning and supporting their clients in their net zero journeys. And we've been doing a lot of work across the industry in looking at lending and investment portfolios, in benchmarking where they are now in terms of the carbon standards, and identifying the plan of where they need to get to. The second area is around stewardship. It's really nice that we see across the industry a lot of organisations both working individually and together in areas such as sort of Climate Action 100, in making sure that the industry is consistent and is pushing the message. And then the third would then be working with public policy, and I think GFANS has been a great example of this. Is really working to help governments and public policy understand what they need to support them.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. That really frames very nicely the discussion that we're going to have, I'm sure. Agnès, if I could come to you, BNP Paribas, a real leader in sustainable finance. What have your experience been in trying to scale up capital markets to enable the net zero transition?
Thank you, and very nice meeting most of you, I think. I feel I need to make a small disclaimer. As you can hear, I'm French. I've never worked in France, so hopefully, I deserve to sit on the panel. What I would say is, through my lens, is sustainable capital markets. What I would say is sustainable finance is really the tip of the iceberg. I still do feel that it's a real catalyst for transformation, for discussion. That's where effectively we always tell our clients, whether they are corporates, whether they are public financial institutions, coming to sustainable markets, you have to have really your house in order when it comes to ESG if you are going to come with the stable finance transaction. So the bar is really higher, but it's by no means the only area where we need to see capital flowing to assets. And I was trying to think, within the report, what I've seen the most prominent over the last few years, and I was listening with quick attention to John, describing so many years of history effectively in this area. It's really what has changed is, do we get enough transparency? Do we get really data that we can rely on, that we can work with? And it starts sounding like a book, but I think we are somewhere where things are going to start changing, because there have been so many commitments made that there is no way back. Effectively, now we have to show some reliable data to both at the EU level. What is really in the works on the stable finance side, let's say security provider, and looking at having them supervised, and basically all this entity that provides a second opinion, it's especially those that have not merged with credit rating agencies, they are all setting their service aligned with the credit rating agency's way of doing things, but they can see that everything is going to be supervised eventually, and that means also, in my opinion, but probably only mine at this stage, it means that ESG ratings will also have a lot more scrutiny and better data, and that's really the starting point. If we don't know what we are talking about, we can do for a long time. So transparency really has been key, and that's really on the mind of our clients. Accountability, for me, it's a big, change. And when I looked at all the commitments that were done, the Net Zero Alliances, and Paribas was one of the early signatories on the banking side and asset manager, I started thinking that's too good to be true, actually, because that definitely means that things need to change. And again, you want to have a setup where you have to deliver, and if you don't, it's visible, and that's, I think, accountability is key. And regulators have a key role to play, because in a way they are the constants in a tumultuous time. And I thought what John was mentioning, which I was aware of, 2007, global pandemic as a first risk, and then it came down to the part because there were other concerns. That's what worries me most at the moment, because there are so many concerns lying ahead that are problems that we have today and tomorrow. And Bob County was great. It's describing tragedy of the horizon. Things are not really, we have examples of climate change happening now, but and the regulators, and we see it with our EU-based clients in the EU, they really have in mind what they have to start reporting on, and the UK taxonomy, so I'll pause there. But there are lots of in a 10-point plan, there is lots of that.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Richard, the role of insurance in net zero and transition beyond that of an asset owner is often poorly understood by those outside the industry. Could you explain to us the insurance market's role and why it's important?
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much. Hopefully I'll switch my microphone on. Yeah, I think you're right. Sometimes it is misunderstood. The insurance industry is seen as a de-risking mechanism. And if you listen to John's opening remarks, a lot of this is about de-risking in order to speed up this. So I think there is a key role to play in the core elements of our business, but we don't always articulate it perhaps in the right way. So again, with John's opening remarks in mind, we're trying to articulate the role of the industry in a way that is reflected in the way people think about their financial performance. So I might maybe explain that in 3 different ways. So one of those is the notion of physical resilience. It's something we've been doing for years. I think, that's all about how the climate is changing, the way the windstorm behaviors are changing, floods, droughts, heat waves, etc., are causing very different shapes and styles of risk for individual firms and economies and societies. So we're getting increasingly people coming to us wanting a forward-looking view of that rather than the normal rearward-looking view, which is what we've tended to do in the past. We have a lot of tools for that. We've been doing it probably since the mid-1980s, building a forward-looking view of risk into that, helping people understand the impact on assets that they're investing in now of the way the weather will change in 5 to 10 to 15 years' time. Now, are we going to get that all right? No, we're not, but we're going to be able to provide indicative advice and link that to changes in the way our risk transfer products work. And that's a whole other subject, so I won't bore you with that today. The second area is probably the risks and liabilities associated with transition for a corporation or any other entity, because a lot of that is forced on them by regulatory change or legal change or economic change, the way their investors are changing, the way they think, the way their consumers are changing, the way they think, the way their supply chains are being disrupted. So there's a lot of risk associated with fixing that and making themselves resilient to those costs. So there are plenty of things we can do in our industry, whether that's advisory or risk transfer that helps with that. And actually, there's a lot of new liability emerging in the landscape as well. Not just the obvious ones where a company makes a net zero commitment and then doesn't know how they're going to execute on it, which is happening out there, believe it or not. And in a lot of countries in the world, that exposes you to class actions. So there's a lot of risk for directors and officers and things like that, which again is the topic is meat and drink for us, but we have to add this new set of risks into it and build a new set of products which will help to put a collar, if you like, on those risks. And then the last one, which I think is the most, or the less understood element of it, is the notion of how we can unlock opportunities again. So to John's opening remarks, there's a lot of what we do already. Not many things get built in the world without there being an insurance policy in place first. Your money doesn't get committed for an offshore wind farm until the insurance policy is in place, for example. That's an obvious thing which we don't often articulate. How do we more appropriately think about debt and equity and insurance all at the same time, rather than thinking about two of them first and then insurance afterwards? Because I actually think that would probably offer a number of opportunities that way. And then we're building some new products that we put together something which is called intellectual property solutions. Basically, we've made an asset out of something that was intangible. You can then loan against that asset. So the insurance has made debt providers comfortable to give money where they wouldn't give money before. And similarly with some sort of clean tech performance products, they put a floor on tech output. It's a bit like a contract for difference, only different. So it's a similar theme where we're trying to make it easier for debt providers and off-takers to come together, particularly in areas like the energy transition. So I think unlocking opportunity is the least understood area.
Thank you. That's really comprehensive. Thanks so much. Hugh, you're the government person in the room, so no pressure. Thanks so much for being with us. And we really welcome the way that BEIS has gone about consulting on the green finance strategy. We look forward to seeing, how that evolves and how you take on board our points. And we're particularly interested because I know you have a background in finance as well, in what you thought of the report and what your reaction is to the 10-point plan. You don't have to react to all of them, but if you could pick a few out, that would be great.
No, thank you very much. And I think as many in this room will be aware, just under 2 years ago, we actually issued our own 10-point plan in two prime ministers ago, I think it was, on the same theme. But I'd also like to thank John for his opening comments, especially in relation to what BEIS and the FCDO have done in joint collaboration, and also to reiterate his comment that the carbon budgets, were set up in 2008. I mean, that's a way back now, and they are legally binding on government. So, and I know there were some comments on changeability of government and regulatory change maybe being uncertain. However, the fact that they are actually in law does commit future governments to meeting those, which I think is quite a strong underpinning for what we're doing on carbon reduction and on the energy transition side. And also, and I think this is 3 prime ministers ago now, the 2050 target was obviously set by Theresa May, one of our final acts, and that again is clearly set down by the UK government. I think we were, pretty much the first government to actually do that. So we have a strong underpinning from the sort of legal side to commit ourselves to pushing forward. Now, I know the issues today are very much about how government and the private sector, especially the financial sector, can work together to better deliver net zero. And I have obviously had a review of some of the points. I won't cover all of them, but certainly the first 2 or 3 are probably important. And I think especially in terms of providing detailed long-term net zero strategy, clearly, again, I think as Emma mentioned, we do a lot of consultation on a lot of policy areas. We do get not complaints, but we get feedback from across both finance and industry that maybe we do too many consultations. But one thing we are doing now, and as this was announced, I think only last week, is that Chris Skidmore is doing a further net zero review of our 2050 policy, which is due to be, I think, released or reported on by the end of this year, or maybe the very beginning of next year. And his remit includes, and I think this was in the commentary on the time when the announcement was made, was to ensure that our policies are effectively pro-growth, which is the new buzzword, and also pro-business. And I think hopefully that should encourage people in this room that we are looking to be financially aware as we go forward with our 2050 plans. So I think in terms of the big picture, we're definitely still committed, and I'm sure the review will hopefully pave the way for that. Second point was on looking at the sort of a national policy for capital raising, net zero capital raising. I don't think that's something that we're necessarily going to be stipulating ourselves in terms of a financial target, although clearly, as I said, we have net zero, we have annual carbon budgets to meet. But what I would say is, and this again relates to something that John was mentioning, was that what we have done at BEIS and at DEC before that was provide the business model support to crowd in private investment, especially into areas which, frankly, for a lot of the net zero areas are going to be first of a kind. So, I can remember 15, 20 years ago, people talking about offshore wind as being some pie in the sky type thing. And of course, now it's mainstream, but supported by CFDs that we put in place a decade, and now effectively almost the CFDs are not really needed because of the efficiencies that have been made in offshore wind. And we're now doing the same in areas like carbon capture and hydrogen. And again, I think as John and others have mentioned, with carbon capture at this scale, it's pretty much first of a kind. And so we are providing, or will be providing, incentives for and support mechanisms for industry, whether that be CFDs or maybe a regulated asset-based model, has to be seen finally, but it'll be something along those lines to basically make sure that industry and investors, where they come in, can almost make it like a bankable project, probably an insurable project as well. But I think that's probably the other key, and I think it was touched upon in the report, that some of these areas are not, strictly speaking, fully investable at this point. A lot of the investments coming in from, for example, in carbon capture and hydrogen, the major oil and gas companies, you have to do this as part of their sort of way forward for them. However, with time, I'm sure that private debt will be able to come in to support those projects. And again, that will be supported by the business models that we put in place. And finally, on that area, again, you may have noticed that we have committed almost £700 million to the next new gigawatt scale nuclear power station, Sizewell C. And the key point on Sizewell, and this is going to relate to nuclear across the patch, is that we passed with no amendments, which I think is a record for a bill, and with total cross-party support, a bill to establish a regulated asset-based model for new nuclear in the UK. And this, I'm pretty sure, I'm convinced, it's the first time this has been done anywhere in the world. And what it means is that for both equity and debt, they can see the prospect of a return during the construction phase, which makes it very bankable, hopefully, on both debt and equity. It'd be very similar to what we've seen with Thames Tideway, where again you have the same principles. So I think from that point of view, certainly we have provided the tools for finance to come in and hopefully provide the funds for nuclear, which again is increasingly being seen as a key area to get towards net zero for both the UK and elsewhere in the world. I think probably I'll stop at that point. I mean, there are many other points, but I don't think they're going to be names I can really pick up on directly. But I think just to reiterate that we have the legal framework which commits us to getting towards net zero, and we have provided the business model support, which does allow private finance to be crowded in alongside any government support that may be given.
Thanks so much. Maybe I could just ask you a follow-up question about the Chris Skidmore review. Will there be an opportunity for us as the the financial related professional services industry to feed into that? And is the expectation that he will make recommendations that then the government will take up to be pro-growth and pro-business? Is this about the how rather than the what?
Okay, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure, especially in terms of how much finance or industry will be able to feed into that. Clearly, he's already engaged on a countrywide tour
Sure.
looking at key areas of our net zero industry. So I'm hoping he'll be putting in views from across industry and finance, but I can't 100% guarantee that. And also how the output will be used, again, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure we'll see as time develops.
Well, we'll know soon enough anyway.
we will.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you. See lots of nice people here. Oh yes, great. A question. Pete, have
Hi,
you got,
yeah, Pete Horrell from Fidelity. I'd be very interested in the panel's views on, particularly in the context of we've got 10 years. How far can we get on carbon pricing? Yeah, and what does that realistically sort of mean in terms of the impacts that we can have as a financial centre?
who wants to take that? How far can we get on carbon pricing in the next 10 years? Agnès?
I don't feel the most suit actually in front.
That's okay, don't worry.
I don't feel the most suited to answer, to be fair. But it's always sounded to me like it's really the bazooka that you probably want to have at some point, but the less easy to maneuver. And so, okay, of course, some parts of our banks are looking at it a lot more than I would, and they may do it slightly differently, but I've seen so much good developments even without it that, at least from where I stand, we do a lot of things without waiting for that. But again, that's really probably high level view.
No, I think it's really useful. So thank you.
I think government action aside, obviously, we I think to really crack that, it will have to be, and of course, you can't just do it in one territory either. So it's obviously, but I think on the voluntary carbon market side, I think the thing that it's crying out for above anything else is a sort of quality assurance trust element. And I think actually everybody on this panel could have a role to play in that, thinking it through, because that's the one area where people are just so uncertain, particularly on some of the nature-based solutions, of course, which without which we're not going to get there either. Never mind transition, the economy, the real world economy, we're all in. So I think that's the other big element is building trust very, very quickly in the voluntary carbon markets, whether or not we get some sort of collective global government action.
And do you think that's possible to build that trust? Because there seems to be quite a bit of skepticism in some quarters.
Yeah, there is, and I think understandably so, because there have been a few horror stories out there, and a number of people have had their fingers burnt. But in fact, several fingers, probably their left arm in some cases. But I think yes, I think it is possible, because there's a lot of mechanisms emerging which are all about ratings and quality assurance, but they don't necessarily have the stamp of approval of a financial services stamp, if that makes sense. They're companies which have been developed for that specific purpose, to become rating agencies or standard setters. And although they're doing great work, and actually in many cases it's quite credible, it doesn't have that stamp of approval that you get via the financial services. So I think building financial products that come along with those standards or underpin those standards, I think might be something that would accelerate it quicker than it would otherwise do.
Right, thank you.
Can we put it back to the gentleman from Dudley? It sounded like it was a loaded question that you maybe have.
You got the answer?
No, I mean the reason I ask it is because I think it's one of the most complex things to kind of address, and sort of and the reason I framed it in the way I did is we've got 10 years, so kind of to get to a global system of how you price carbon and trade internationally and link that to taxes, it's like inventing the whole financial system globally, in extremis, but clearly for all of us in financial services, the more you can translate something into a price, the faster everything will move. And I guess my view of sort of where we are, I mean, a bit as you were saying, is we have to have trading and assurance mechanisms towards a target. They're not the equivalent of a monetary system, and the sort of the price and the systems will come in due course. But I think it's tricky to see price getting sophisticated enough quick enough to really be a driver in the sort of near and medium term that's fast enough. I suppose that's my, that was a bit. God,
Agnès, you were saying that there's lots of things that you can.
That's gonna,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, we'll get you another seat. And Agnès, you were saying there's lots of things that you can do in the meantime anyway. That was that you.
I managed that. I think, I mean, and we have a desk that is really looking at carbon trading, whether on the regulated or voluntary market. So that's why I was saying it was probably not the one with the more detailed view. But where I found in the space of the last 5 years, when we've been going to see any type of issuers, again, you know, going from sovereigns all the way to SMEs. And to me, sustainable finance is a bit the, you know, is the canary in the coal mine, or the one that tells you the earliest indicator in a way. And when we were going to see our clients 5 years ago, 8 times out of 10, I had to really convince them why it was a good idea to start considering sustainable finance. Now it's probably, you know, maybe once in a blue moon, someone is skeptic, and it's more often actually, okay, actually we are late. Just tell me how it's being done and how to do it well. And all this without carbon pricing, but with a lot of scrutiny and pressure for all stakeholders onto doing things. And I think that's why, and I've really seen an increase in speed with regulatory focus increasing. And that's why I'm saying there is, but I mean, we can discuss here whether the depth of regulation, the speed needs to be pushed. Is it well written, or, you know, all this we can discuss it, but we can't argue, I think, that it focuses the mind, because if, you know, if on the investor side, you know that you have to start the reporting in a year time, well, everything is going to start moving. And that's where I've seen a lot happening just based on, look, you have to start reporting, just where are the numbers, and you start to put targets on it, and then you start looking at your peers and say, well, actually they've reported and it looks pretty good, or actually not so good, we can do better. So yeah.
Yeah, I can just chip in. Obviously, I can't make any comment about any policies towards carbon markets here, but I would pick up on Agnès' point about the compulsory reporting, and, you know, increasingly, it's not strictly directly us, but clearly it is coming in. And there was actually one of the points on the 10-point plan was to extend it to SMEs and private companies. Now, you know, at this point, I can't say whether that's a plan or not, but clearly we do have, we do include smaller companies in the remit for reporting currently. And I think, as Agnès was saying, it does make a difference because you get some peer pressure coming in. The other point I'd make is just quickly, this is not on carbon pricing or markets per se, but as we move ahead with our scheme to do carbon capture in the UK, I think increasingly that may well begin to focus people's minds on the price of carbon, because we're effectively asking emitters to capture carbon from a power station or from a cement plant. And then we're also asking somebody to build a pipeline and then push it back into the North Sea. So somewhere, there has to be some calculation on how much it's all costing, which is probably going to come down to the cost of whatever the carbon molecules that are being moved around. So that may well begin to focus people's minds a little bit more on that aspect.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yes, thanks so much. I just want to make a comment about flow of capital. And I do that from a perspective of seeing what's happening as a practitioner, and that is around the way that ESG mandates are increasingly excluding miners. In other words, they're not differentiating between those that are mining fossil fuels like coal and those that have an absolutely intrinsic part to play in mining copper, lithium, and other things that are so important. So I think part of the communications, part of the way in which we deal with that is I think to encourage investors, and I'm talking about large numbers of small private investors, to understand the difference within an ESG framework of what's good and what's bad, because it is, I think, has the potential to be quite disruptive in terms of, because it's reliant almost exclusively on large tranches of private capital in the unlisted marketplace, rather than through the listed marketplace, where the disclosures around ESG matters are far more obvious. So it's more of a comment, I think, but I'd be interested to hear if
maybe building on that, there's that worry about the bifurcation of sort of the private markets and the public markets and what needs to be disclosed. Isabelle, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really fascinating point, and we've done some work again with the City UK and an organisation called Rewired Earth, which is looking about, because it's helping investors understand, and we're talking, right down to retail investors, what is important to them, and then helping them match their priorities against the investable asset, and really understanding what that asset is. And John mentioned it, and everybody's mentioned it. One of the really big issues at the moment is this fact about data, the availability of data, and then the consistency of reporting. So this point about, and going right back to the first principles of the investors and helping them to understand what they are investing in, and does that meet their investment requirements, I think is really important. And that, if we can start bridging, there's a bit about little steps and starting to implement that, I think that will make a big difference.
Yeah.
I can make a couple of quick comments. I mean, one sort of governmental, one personal, is the sort of higher level, is because I spent a lot of time talking to major investors, mainly on the infra side, because of what we're doing across the patch in terms of large scale projects. But we do see clearly, I'm sure everyone in the room sees the same thing. It's the influence of not a bad influence, it's the influence of trustees and the ESG pressure that's coming in from there on major institutions. And if you go to the large insurance straight pension companies who want to invest in infrastructure because it gives them good returns over a long time for pensions and insurance. However, everything has to go through an ESG committee first before it even gets to working out whether you can invest in it, which is, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just saying people have to be aware there's a different layer. Then you're talking about private investors who don't have trustees, they're just going to put their own money in. The only thing I would say is, as a personal comment, and actually aside from having been a ECM and analyst for many years, my degree was actually in mining engineering, but the oil engineering. But the one thing I'd say, that coal mine up in Cumbria, where there was a lot of shilly-shallying as to whether it should go ahead or not, clearly that coal was never going to be burnt. It was just to make steel, which is actually the thing we need to build many things. So that's my personal comment, and that's where you saw there's a lot of press comment saying, "Oh, it's evil coal," but actually it was coal that's going to be used to make steel, not to be burnt in anywhere, which is interesting dichotomy. But it is a good point that increasingly we are going to need vast amounts of copper and vast amounts of lithium, and I think that's just where everything is going to be electrified. So that is going to be a requirement, and but then you do have, especially on areas like cobalt, for example, you have, especially the S and the G side is off the scale in terms of being potentially bad, and lithium likewise on the E side. So there are many nuances there, which maybe aren't fully appreciated. But
can I make one final comment? Is one of the big changes you've seen in that particular sector is just how much cost there is on the balance sheet now for effective remediation.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So at the end of the useful life term for the mine, very often the environmental returns are greater than they were at the start. So it is crucial, because I don't think that there'll be enough of the raw material to move things forward. It's necessary, unless there is a change of mind around these things.
And it is difficult, isn't it? Because again, if you take the sort of concept back to transition finance, so again, a number of the large banks are looking at their existing clients and looking at what those clients' net zero journeys need to be, and therefore the investment then takes them from A to B. But actually, that there's a lot of concern about what will the external stakeholders, what the public, what the press think about, because their investment in sort of bad companies will have to go up before it can come down. And how do you explain that? And that's quite difficult.
Anybody want to come in?
No, maybe just a brief point, which is not quite the same but related, because it's again with those private investors in mind. I mean, even in everyone in this room, I'm sure this is an obvious point, but you know, in our industry, when I worked for a broking house, so when we first started to talk to insurers about the whole notion of ESG and how they were executing their commitments, their first thing is just to walk away from things because it's the easiest thing to do, obviously. And I know that's an obvious point to everybody, but the, you know, what they hadn't seemed to grasp, which again is something that a lot of private investors haven't grasped, is not just the point you made, which is you've got to increase your investment in things which don't look great at the beginning in order to make it better in the long run, but also the fact that a lot of these firms are on a journey of their own anyway. So they might not look great right now. And yes, there's a trust issue and whether or not they're actually executing on the plan and whether it's real. So I understand that, back to the trust point we were talking about earlier. But the private investors don't often realise that greening is just an important thing.
Yeah.
I know that's an obvious point to everybody here, but it is not obvious to the wider world and the private investor, I don't think. Yeah.
Well, I mean, some local council pension funds are pulling out of anything that's not
Yeah.
green. And I think the point that your colleague makes, Isabelle, is if everybody did that, then you wouldn't be able to finance the transition because.
You won't get to net,
Yeah.
you'll never get to net zero because you haven't got the funding to do it.
But some of the NGOs are calling.
Yeah.
For that sort of line of action. Yeah.
I just also make a quick further comment, which again is more personal than professional, but it's the effect of selling shares in a mining company is almost negligible in terms of the actual company's business, right? It's just making a stand, right? Whereas clearly, you know, if the company is actually selling new shares in an IPO, or you're actually raising money for the company, but selling shares is more it's taking a stand. It doesn't actually affect the company's underlying business clearly. But anyway, that's my own personal comment there.
Maybe
Right.
just as an example, 10 days ago now, we priced a transaction for Anglo American, which is a sustainability-linked bond, which is the first diversified miner really to have come with such a transaction. And we worked with them for a very long time, kind of refining the KPI they were going to use. And there are 3 KPIs, but one of them is scope 1 and 2 GHG emission reduction. Actually, as you will probably know very well, for such a company effectively and for the sector, scope 3 is the big emissions because that's the steel manufacturer's emissions, and we are still not at the point where you reduce them drastically. And we were actually, I mean, that was, you know, the reason we went ahead with it, but there was always, you know, for me, there was always the thought, okay, are investors going to really kind of take the time to analyze this and accept the fact that actually there won't be any scope 3 as a KPI in this transaction? And actually, you know, it was clearly explained in the framework, you know, why scope 3 wasn't a KPI in the transaction. And the reaction was a lot more, I mean, investors were really positive actually on the transaction. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised that there was a real discussion and a real understanding that yes, ideally, scope 3 being the largest emission, you would want it, but for X and Y reason, this is not a good idea at this point in time, and generally not a good idea.
Thank you. Thanks, Agnès. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Val Nelson, MG. I have a question. I mean, the plan makes a very obvious and very necessary point about policy alignment. And we've had some interesting announcements from the new government. What should the sector, what should our industry be doing to keep the focus on policy alignment for net zero when there are some very necessary, very pressing social challenges that need to be addressed? How does the panel think we should be prioritizing them, both in terms of our advocacy and then what we as firms do? I was struck, Isabelle, by your point about the necessary to invest in the bad to enable them to be less bad. And there seems to be a very strong S element in that, as well as a E.
Yes, absolutely. And you go straight to all the principles of a just transition, but from that and actually what it, you know, if I'm going to move my funding away and not invest in a mining company, well, what does it mean to the employees? I think it's a really interesting question. I think some of the things that we've seen in the industry about stewardship, the industry coming together and aligning and being consistent is really important. And being consistent with policymakers as to what are the frameworks you need to operate in, but having that consistency. We were at a a really interesting breakfast this morning, and there was discussion that no, absolutely there wouldn't be a as you say, there are legal commitments around ESG, the regulation related to it. That is a really important focus for the government. But it's going to be a period of some uncertainty. So actually, I think there's a bit that the industry needs to work together to have a viewpoint and keep communicating that viewpoint.
Do you want to go?
I can say something quickly. So, but were you from M&G or LNG? Oh, okay, right. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we have policies that have been designed to get us towards net zero by 2050. I think all I'd say is, in the very short term, and as you've seen with pretty much every other government, we have had to react to events. And so, the most recent document we put out was called the Energy Security Strategy, because I think, we want to make sure that people have the lights on over Christmas. Right? I mean, this year, this winter, and next winter, right? And it is difficult from a policy point of view to balance every factor. Clearly, we all talk about the trilemma, and I've heard people talk about a quadlemma as well, but trilemma. We're balancing factors from affordability issues, security of supply issues, and net zero issues. And clearly, for the last 6 months or so, we've had to focus on security of supply as well as affordability. And I think the package we put out even just a couple of weeks back to help families through this winter is, I think, quite important. But you're seeing other governments having to do the same thing at the same time. But underlying everything else, as I mentioned before, is our commitment to net zero 2050 and the carbon budgets. So they haven't gone away, but there are other issues which probably are more pressing currently than well, I mean, they're not more pressing. I'm talking in circles now. I mean, clearly, net zero isn't going to go away. It's still very important, but we have to make sure that people, can heat themselves over the winter. So I think it's very important.
So I would say that there's two other points I would make to that. So one is that we should be able to argue that all the things we've been talking about today, in terms of investing in things which are going to deliver transition to net zero, in reality will help avoid the challenges that we're facing at the moment. Not exclusively, this is not the only reason, but I think we've got to keep that decision, because that maybe will help the government to keep making some things which help in the short term. And then the second one for me, which actually is raised in the report, having read an embargo copy this morning, briefly on the train, but which I was pleased to see, is the whole notion of competition and the Competition Act and how we interpret that. And I was pleased to read that there is some view that there might be some wiggle room in the Competition Act, because I don't think we can do any of this unless we actually take some actions both within specific markets like insurance and banking and across, which would currently be expressly prohibited by the Competition Act, and the way the FCA interprets that and regulates it. So, it's always a risk when someone like me sits here and says that we should tell the FCA to go away and leave us alone, because that's not what I'm saying. But we do, I think, and we've been banging this message for a while, and any select committee we can get into, most politicians, I think that's really critical. Not to let everybody loose, because that will have the opposite effect, but in certain specific areas to allow us to collaborate in ways that set benchmarks, that agree on data sets, that enable us to produce indices around which we can then all compete like mad in the way that we normally do. And I think that is something the government could help us with, without having to divert attention from some of the pressing engagements that they have now. That would be the other.
Thank you.
I was just going to say on the social element, it's true that I guess at the moment it would be extremely difficult to push any sort of environmental action without, counterbalancing what it means from a social perspective. Maybe it has been at some point. I don't think it will be true. And yes, the concept of just transition, I've heard it so many more times now than, over the last few years. And so definitely, I think that we have to act as a fact that, we cannot dissociate the two, for sure. And one thing that is interesting, especially in the UK Green Guild was a bit of a precursor, effectively, saying, and they were the first really notable, at least green bond that said, look, we are going to invest in green project, but we'll report also on the social co-benefits, whether it's employment generated and so on. And I would assume that you will see a lot more of that to really show you take the two into consideration.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I think we're out of time. I think we could probably talk all evening, but we won't. We'll keep to time. I wanted to say a big thank you to our panel. I think we've had a really interesting discussion. Thank you to the audience. Thank you again to PwC for hosting, but also for writing the report with us. I just want to say a word about my colleague Katrina Ross, who has spent a lot of time and working in partnership with PwC on the report too, and the CityUK team. So I want to thank Katrina and the rest of the team too. And thanks for your participation. And I'm sure, well, this report's very timely, and we'll keep plugging away with our 10-point plan. We could have a 20-point plan, and we add them to the 10 points from the government. But thanks so much. Thanks again.